So I noted this morning that talking about spirituality and digital culture is a kind of contested conversation in terms of whether there really is any value in digital culture for spiritual formation. And I tried to offer some ways and opportunities this morning, but I promised that I'd also talk about some of the challenges. And so that's what I want to do tonight. I want to help us look at some of the research and studies that have been done on relational aggression, cyberbullying, sexting, and adolescent drama in order to consider how those of us who are concerned with the spiritual nurture of children and young adults, children, youth, and young adults, might interpret and effectively respond to what these studies suggest about how digital culture affects young people. Let me just remind you of a couple of things I said this morning about how prevalent digital culture is in our world. That more than 95% of teens are online in the United States. That children who are as young as 9 years old are social media users, most of them with their parents' permission and assistance, even though the usual minimum age for these social media sites is 13. And therefore, this kind of underage use is quite common in our culture, and that adults tend to be very anxious about the ways in which digital culture affects children. And in fact, I talked a little bit about the whole internet risk narrative that adults have and all the litany of things that we're concerned about when it comes to young people. So let me say a bit more about some of these concerns and why it is that we are likely to have developed this kind of risk narrative when it comes to young people. We have to go back in time a little bit to the legacy of psychologist G. Stanley Hall, who in the early 20th century constructed the social category that we know as adolescence. Before that point, we really didn't have a notion of youth or adolescence. And he talked about this new category of adolescence as a social category that points to both the social vulnerability of young people and also their potentially delinquent social behavior. And he believed that children were primarily untrustworthy creatures that were needed our protection. So youth or adolescents were untrustworthy, they needed protection. His ideas about young people continue to inform the way that we think about them, this kind of almost a schizophrenic type binary sort of form, where we look at children as morally unformed, but also innocent. And we look at adolescents as unstable, hormonally driven, and morally suspect, and yet the future of our race and our society. Dana Boyd, who does a lot of research in the area of media and young people, observes that contemporary youth experience numerous ways in which the state or their parents impose limitations on when and where they can gather and what they can do, precisely because we're worried about what they'll get up to if we leave them alone. And in this kind of binary system of you're the future and you're also someone we're terribly afraid is going to fail, um, agency of adolescence is quite restricted to either being positively reinforced if they submit to adult authority or negatively judged as resistant to adult mandates. In other words, you're either an obedient youth or a rebellious youth. And neither one is particularly good for your self identity. Furthermore, adult surveillance of youth activities, even when it's done with the best of intentions, tends to circumscribe youth agency in some particularly oppressive kinds of ways. When youth exist in an adult controlled system of external rewards or external punishments, teens don't have much room to cultivate an intrinsic system of moral reasoning. And therefore, their behavior is done to please others or to reject others, rather than because they themselves have reflected and determined that that's a good course of action. Perhaps this is why we have yet another new category of growing up, that of the emerging adult. Not quite an adolescent still, because they are legally of adult age, but not really on their own either, because they're still financially dependent on their parents. Maybe they're engaged in a higher education where they have the university or college acting in loco parentis, etc. And so there's an even longer liminal state between childhood and adulthood for many Western young people. What Dana Boyd argues from her work, and I agree with her perspective, is that social media, far from being the seductive Trojan horse that adults make it out to be, is actually functioning as a release valve for many teens, allowing youth to reclaim a kind of meaningful sociality as a tool for managing the pressures and the limitations around them as they try to practice being social and moral agents in the world. It's a space where adults don't reside and where young people can then try out being a little bit more grown up. What Boyd and others are suggesting is that our ability to effectively analyze and respond constructively to young people's participation in digital culture has been compromised by a few ways in which we've understood what digital culture is. One of the ways is in the way that we construct children or e-kids as vulnerable, always vulnerable, and therefore in need of severe protection or something bad is going to get them. But we also tend to mute young people's voices. We don't listen to them when they talk to us about how they're using social media or what it is that they're trying to do when they interact online. Thirdly, as a society, we have relegated privacy concerns to private management. We made it every individual's responsibility to figure out how to keep private information private rather than legislating privacy concerns in a way that holds corporations and organizations more responsible. And although there's some of that kind of legislation beginning, we still see how little of that. It's always about us opting in or opting out of particular privacy concerns. And then fourthly, we've conflated different kinds of risks. We've simply said that there's this risk and that risk and the other risk, all those things on the risk narrative, and we've made them as if they're all equally dangerous when some of them are very rare and others are a bit more common. So adopting a view of young people's participation in digital culture that resists these four problematic practices permits those of us who are concerned about the spiritual utility and value of internet activities to think critically and creatively about how to interpret and respond to potential problems, problems like cyberbullying or sexting. And so I want to look specifically at those two and think about how we might address them in a more measured and collaborative way with our young people. And I choose cyberbullying and sexting because there's a bit more attention in the research literature to these than some of the others that we've named. The first challenge, if we're going to engage in a thoughtful reflection on spirituality and cyberbullying, is defining what we mean by cyberbullying. Definitions in the literature vary from an expansive notion of, quote, hurting someone else using information and communication technologies, end quote, to using technology tools to, quote, deliberately antagonize and intimidate others or intentionally cause harm. Some studies list specific types of behavior under the heading of cyberbullying, such as call names, threatening another, telling another individual's secrets, and excluding them. Several scholars and practitioners have adapted a widely accepted definition of traditional or offline bullying to online experiences. This more nuanced definition has three key components for bullying: the intent to harm, repetition, and a notable power differential between the one who is bullying and the one who is being bullied. This means that traditional bullying has been understood as a type of aggressive or purposely harmful behavior that's intentional, is repeated, and is based on a power imbalance between the aggressor and the target. If we take this widely accepted definition in the psychotherapeutic literature and think about it in relation to digital culture, we then get a definition that cyberbullying is an aggressive behavior that's repeatedly and intentionally carried out against a defenseless victim using electronic forms of contact. Recognizing that there are a wide range of behaviors that are potentially included in the category of cyberbullying helps us to make sense of the desperate research findings regarding the prevalence of this kind of behavior among children and youth online. Studies that have the broad definition tend to report cyberbullying victimization rates as high as 72%, whereas those that use the narrower psychotherapeutic definition of cyberbullying find that the rate is as low as 4%. High percentages reflect self-reported experiences of being put down, called names, or treated rudely, even if those experiences occurred because of a falling out among friends or happened only one time. Cyberbullying perpetuation rates, those of who actually engages in this kind of cyberbullying, range from 36% if we use the broad definition, or 3% if we use the narrower definition. And those higher rates often reflect a yes response to questions about whether the respondent has ever called someone a name online or posted something unkind. In one study, only 19% of teens reported being cyberbullied in the past year, but 88% said they had witnessed mean or cruel behavior on social media. Young people often characterize this mean behavior not as bullying or cyberbullying, but as drama, a term that Dana Boyd helpfully defines for us as a kind of performative and interpersonal conflict that takes place in front of an active, engaged audience, often on social media. The concept of drama is actually quite helpful to us because it helps us make sense of an aspect of young people's online behavior that has been stymieing researchers interested in the phenomenon of cyberbullying. And that's the problem of reciprocal engagement in name calling, put downs, and rude comments that meant that most study participants would end up being categorized as both perpetrators and victims because they'd either been called a name or called a name, and therefore they'd end up in both categories. In their interviews with teens, Marwick and Boyd found that their subjects distinguished between drama and any type of bullying based on whether the interaction was bidirectional, which made it drama. You know, I say something mean about you, you say something mean about me. Or if it was unidirectional and power differentiated, in which someone who had more status in the peer group was saying negative things about someone who was seen as being much lower in the pecking order. And they called that bullying. This suggests that from an adolescent perspective, much of the relational aggression that occurs among teenagers is part of their developmental process of experimenting with and manipulating social identity and relationships in search of acceptance, popularity, and status. In other words, much of what's going on online is the same thing that goes on in school corridors, where young people poke fun at and press their press on people to see how they'll hold up, what they'll do, how they'll be received in that moment, whether someone will hold them accountable or not, all the kinds of things that young people regularly do at this stage in life to figure out who they're going to be going forward. The performative aspect of teenage drama explains why the internet is a desirable setting for employing relational aggression. Online sites are going to provide a much wider and immediate audience before which to play out these interpersonal conflicts. Drama participants strategically act to appeal to their peers. They invite others to witness the conflict as bystanders, but they also want them to participate through their comments, through emojis, through likes, and through other online actions that get them to pick sides and decide who's the more powerful one in this smackdown of words. In addition, most of the studies have found that neither drama nor bullying are restricted to online activities among teens. Since both forms of relational aggression commonly occur among people who know each other, they tend to move back and forth between online and offline contexts. One study that used a broad definition of cyberbullying found that 60% of cyberbullying victims retaliated on school grounds to the kind. Since sites such as Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, and Snapchat typically serve as extensions to the unmediated spaces like schools and parties, where teens use their interpersonal interactions to increase their own status, then the audience typically will take sides in a dramatic incident and carry those sides over into offline spaces. That means that there's a fair amount of value to a young person in getting their interpersonal conflict online and in front of people quickly so that their side might get endorsed by certain people. And then when they come back together again in a face-to-face setting, everybody knows where everybody else stands. Drama is one of these things that, first of all, adults don't enjoy having to work with teens around. And secondly, it has very fuzzy and blurry boundaries. If you think about slapstick comedy or sitcoms that use put downs as part of the humor, you can see how for teens, the boundary between what's a real conflict and a joke can get quite confused, both for the person receiving it and even the person who's making the comments. Hurting or being hurt versus the entertainment value that again is being imitated off of television shows and streaming videos mean that adolescents sometimes feel empowered by the process and sometimes feel disempowered by what's happening. But they are trying to frame their engagement with social conflict, with different understandings of identity in ways that are quite distinct from the perpetrator and victim subjectivities of the bullying narratives that adults use. Because they see it as this sort of negotiation and this trying out of different ways of being. So drama, in the way that developmental stages can do, promotes a kind of agency among young people because it encourages them to disengage with the way that adults are explaining what's going on and instead to create and participate in their own narratives about what's happening. So a young person might say, they're not bullying me, it's just drama. We're just having this tiff. She's my friend and she said this thing and it hurt me, but I realized she was just kind of joking, she was just being silly, and tomorrow we'll be over it. So it becomes harder both for adults to know when it might move over into bullying or cyberbullying, and for young people to prevent adults from jumping to the conclusion that it's bullying when it's really just this sort of dramatic interpersonal negotiation. Cyberbullying, on the other hand, has no kind of redeeming quality. It's not developmentally helpful at all when it actually meets that more narrow criteria. And in fact, the more public the experience of dating, the target's experience. A Swiss study found that adolescents who were 13 or 14 years old characterized public cyberbullying as a very severe form of aggression that has the potential to cause a large amount of damage in a little time. The researchers in that study hypothesized that the public forums of bullying threaten young people's social status, which is very, very important to them. And the presumably wider audience of social media increases the size public to which the bullying and the humiliation that's part of that bullying has exposed them. So that makes it particularly damaging to reputation. These researchers also suggest that teens are actually quite aware of how little control they have over material that's posted online. And this can exacerbate their feelings of helplessness and of losing control when actual bullying is occurring. However, one of the problems with this kind of study, and it's one of the few we actually have on what teens think, is that it focuses on how young people perceive the severity of bullying online and offline rather than actual experiences of being cyberbullied. Because so few teens will actually say that they've experienced being cyberbullied. The fact that the studies using nuanced definitions of cyberbullying still find that offline bullying remains more common than cyberbullying, especially when we're talking about middle schoolers, and that targets of bullying usually experience it both online and offline, particularly at the high school level, makes it difficult to know just what it's like to be someone who's being bullied in this way. But if we look to what traditional targets of bullying tell us, it's this sense of being utterly out of control and helpless in the face of an ongoing onslaught of aggressive criticism. Sexting is a particular form of cyberbullying, perhaps. It's the posting or texting of sexually explicit images, and it can be a kind of relational aggression that rises to the level of cyberbullying. Several studies that have been done in the last 5 or 6 years have found that girls can feel pressured to send boys explicit images of themselves in order to be popular. This is especially true if the girl's peer group views sexting positively and thus reinforces the personal pressure that's being exerted by the boy in question. A very recent study concludes that social pressure is much more influential in terms of whether a young person decides to participate in sexting than that young person's personal values or concerns. So it's very much the sense that I won't belong, I won't be accepted, I won't be loved, or I won't be able to have this person as a boyfriend, girlfriend if I don't do this thing. Viewed in this context, then, sexting can be understood as a kind of online extension of the sexual harassment that female students report that they experience frequently in their daily lives at school. And as such, it does meet the criterion for a kind of power differentiation. And if it's repeated, and if it's intended to cause harm, particularly if those images get shared without permission beyond the original recipient, then it does become cyberbullying. But what we know about sexting is that more often, sexting becomes a part of adolescent communications for non-aggressive reasons. Now, studies do suggest that less than 1 in 10 young people actually send or receive such messages. So despite what you might have heard in the media, there's not an epidemic of sexting going on among our young people. But those who do participate often do so with someone they consider a romantic partner. And they use these images to flirt or to create intimacy with their partners. Sexting also sometimes gets used as a digital form of kind of sexualized adolescent games, a sort of online spin the bottle or truth or dare kind of thing. And it gets used as proof of sexual prowess, particularly among boys who want to demonstrate that they are able to be a sexy guy. Most researchers believe that the primary reason we see sexting among young people today is because the sexualized nature of our consumer culture actually has diminished young people's sense of taboo regarding sexual portrayals of the self. And so they don't really see anything wrong with showing more of their bodies to other people because they see a lot of bodies in popular media. There are, however, still a sort of set of double standards between boys and girls on this score. Boys who sext, whether by posting images of their own bodies or collecting images of female bodies, are generally admired by other boys, whereas girls who sext are less popular with other girls and are viewed negatively by boys as well. So for boys, there's a positive payout and reinforcement. For girls, it's a lowering of status. Researchers have acknowledged the greater danger to girls created by this double standard, observing when circulated in a peer group, a sexualized image becomes a cipher for sexual reputation. Potentially, it was an intimate gesture consensually shared, but it's also potentially dangerous because it exposes girls to judgment and ridicule through practices of rating. Somebody decides how you fit on the scale of sexy or not, and boasting. How then do we respond to these narratives, these challenges of digital culture? If we want to nurture child and adolescent spirituality while also supporting positive well being in the engagement in digital culture, then what can we do? Well, there are some ideas that various social scientists have suggested to us that we might take up that I think can translate into religious practice as well. And one of those is to not perpetuate the risk narratives that emphasize that children are victims and lack agency. Because when we tell children and teens that they are victims, that leaves them without any power to do anything to change what's happening to them. Marwick and Boyd particularly challenged that kind of binary discourse of the bully and the victim. Because when we label young people as either of these, then the teens typically reject those labels. They don't see themselves as a bully, they don't see themselves as a victim. And they're aware that the very things that they're being seen as a victim for, they were called a name, they were something hurtful or unkind was said, that they have done those things themselves. So they don't feel a victim. Does that make them a bully? Or is it in fact this drama that goes back and forth and by and large, because they're equal in power, can be resolved through their working through those relationships with others? When we emphasize the labels for young people, then the way in which status and identity matters so much to this age group means that we treat them as if they're younger and more juvenile and unable to help themselves. And so we don't feed into that sense of a growing sense of personal responsibility and capability that leads to adulthood. So, what most psychotherapists and others suggest is that we adopt the language of drama that adolescents themselves have created, and that we recognize that drama is one of the ways that young people are testing out friendships and understanding the dynamics of popularity and status. And we help them to see which of their strategies actually work to build their friendships and relationships and to help them to feel like competent adults and which ones don't, which is what drama is all about, is testing out different theories. Um, we also recognize that not every mean comment or rude remark creates a bully or a victim. Most of these exchanges, whether they're online or offline, are experimental communications that teach young people how to manage their relationships. And their peers are quite good at indicating when they've gone too far and reining them back in. So we adopt more empowering narratives, that of drama rather than bullying, and we use terminology that begins to look different. Andrew Zerksky, who's a youth minister and has written some on digital culture, says that teenagers are not becoming networked individuals primarily because they use social media. Rather, teenagers employ social technology because it allows them to live more successfully as networked individuals in an already networked society. Dana Boyd observes, through their experimentation and challenges, today's teens are showcasing some of the complex ways in which technology intersects with society. Both of these scholars are trying to point us to the ways in which young people are likely to be more experienced digital participants than the adults who are trying to understand and respond to the spiritual implications of digital culture. Thus, another way to promote young people's well-being is to invite them to share their experiences and their interpretations of those experiences without judgment, and to welcome their online expertise. This strategy is implicitly embedded in that proposed shift to using the primary language that adolescents have designed, that of drama, rather than an adult-generated narrative to describe what's going on. It's also explicitly a part of the adoption of mindfulness practices that empower children and youth to reflect on their own experiences and share their discoveries with one another. If we invite young people to practice mindful tech, like I talked about this morning, then we can ask them to share with us what comes out of that reflection. What are their thoughts on what works for them and what creates problems, tension, stress, anxiety in their bodies? This response is also implicitly included in the kind of bullying responses and online safety education that values children's agency and seeks to empower young people to respond rather than point them towards a kind of dependence on adult judgments and adult protection. As such, this tries to stitch together a variety of elements that we see there. We also want to use the term of target. Oops, my headphone. Yeah. We want to use the term of target rather than victim when we talk about those who actually are being bullied. Why? Because to be a victim is to be disempowered, but to be a target is to be able to deflect that kind of targeted behavior. And when a person can see him or herself as a target who can deflect the attack, then the person can imagine, with the support of others, being empowered to do just that. Whereas the language of victim really underscores the kind of helplessness or out of control feelings that go on there. A study from about 7-8 years ago found that feelings of helplessness increase depressive symptomology in adolescents. And if they've experienced cyberbullying, then they need feelings of social support that will that can mitigate the negative effects of the bullying. They need to know that there are people who will stand with them. And those individuals can be their peers, or adults around them. So if we use language that conveys social support rather than victimization, when we say things like you are not alone or we are here to support you in deflecting this kind of attention, then we help mitigate some of the dangers of cyberbullying on young people. I'm curious as to your thoughts about the religious language that we might bring to play with these kinds of responses. What are some of the narratives or terminology that you could imagine using that empowers young people that might attend to this notion of drama? For instance, what are the biblical stories where we see drama play out among various individuals that eventually resolves in a kind of um, renegotiation of relationships? Can you think of any biblical stories that do that? There you go. There you go. Others? Okay. Mhm. Think about Jesus' disciples too. Any number of times that there's squabbling among them. Who's going to be first and on the right hand or the left? Okay. So drama is actually something that occurs even in religious relationships, even in the stories of our faith. Helping young people to see that drama is not just a teenage thing, but it's actually a human thing, and that it occurred among our biblical forebears as well as occurs in their peer groups, could also be a resource that we could offer. How about language that we use to describe those who are in a weakened position or who are under attack? What do you make of this language of target versus victim? And how do you see that relating to, say, theological language that we might use to refer to the least of these? Yeah. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. So we need to help young people see that they are beloved children of God who have equal value to all other of God's children. Exactly. Exactly. Okay. So building up our sense of who we are as God's people can help young people resist this kind of victimization, deflect the kind of bullying. Any other thoughts on the victim target kind of discourse? Mhm. Yes. Yeah. And it helps those of us who are looking at them to see them as a person with dignity, even if we're not the bully, but if we put them in that sort of one down, helpless place, it's hard for us to see how they can help themselves to be who they're created to be. So dignity, helpful there. Any other thoughts? Yes. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yes. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Mhm. Yes. Yeah. So even what it is that young people are trying to negotiate in terms of their identity and status, we might want to offer some language that suggests it's not about being in the center and always in control. That it may in fact be about being on the margin and being vulnerable for a good reason. Okay. Yes. Yeah. And I think what a lot of the research is showing is that if the young person should be the one to name what it is that they're experiencing. So I would say if a young person says they feel victimized, then I wouldn't contradict them. But what the research tends to show is that young people are reluctant to label themselves as victims. And so in that sense, then it may not help if we impose that label. But yes, if a young person said, I feel like a victim, then I would affirm that feeling and then talk with them about what are other ways that they might engage what's happening in order to find their own power to resist it. Yes. Mhm. Yeah, I mean, again, this is the language that's been proposed by a certain um, social science group, and we do not have to bring, import it into our religious practice, which is why I throw it out there. So yeah, recipient, as long as that isn't about you invited it. But yes, someone over here? Yes. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's part of what adolescents mean when they talk about drama, is that you are, if you engage with a group of people that you let know you very well, it also means you're vulnerable to them when they're upset with you, taking, a sniping at you in some way, and that you work that out rather than let it break the relationship. But vulnerability is not necessarily a word that gets used in a positive sense. So again, we could offer that. What's the difference between being vulnerable and being um, abused, oppressed, gullible, all the other kinds of things that can be difficult to discern for a young person trying to figure out how to maintain relationships? Mhm. Yes, and that could be an important distinction, particularly again if we're talking with young women and the whole sting and the social pressure thing. Is there a difference between feeling like you have to do this to fit in or to make somebody else happy versus a choice you make? We might be opposed to sharing sexual images altogether, but in terms of how we talk about it, we can also talk about the difference in terms of making choices in relationships versus feeling pressured to do something to fit in, which is, again, a part of the developmental process in adolescence. Yes. Mhm. I do not know of an online course. I know of a lot of sort of materials for teachers to use in classrooms. But I haven't found an example of a sort of online course for parents and children. I'm still seeing the book like Screen Smart Parenting that I mentioned this morning, which is designed for families to use to think about these kinds of things. And I think you're right, we could use these kinds of resources. What I hear from parent educators is that parents don't tend to go online. Now, I think that's changing as we have different generations of parents coming through, but that kids go online, and so they develop things for kids about this that get used in schooling settings, but they haven't really developed parenting materials. But I would love to hear about any if you find them. And I do think as we move into, you know, Gen X, Y, Z, particularly Gen Z parents coming up, we'll see a lot more of that because that's how they do their information seeking. So. Let me move to the last one, this engaging young people as experienced digital participants. One of the things I've noticed when I'm in congregations is that there's still anxiety about what young people would do if we let them touch our website, or other kinds of things that suggest that whole they're morally unformed, dangerous personalities is still operating, at least in many congregational settings. So yes, we know they're good at this, but we don't trust them to do stuff that we would like with this. Are there ways that you have seen or are experiencing where young people are being treated as the sort of expert in this area, where they're invited to be the ones that teach adults how it is to engage in good online behavior? One of the places I would suggest you start is by asking young people to talk with you about how privacy can actually be safeguarded online. Because in my experience with young people and in many of the studies that have been done about privacy concerns, young people understand what you have to tick where and how you're able to keep yourself anonymous in certain sites when you go online to buy things. It was my youngest son who showed me how to anonymize my search engine so it can't tell me and then start sending me ads based on what I've looked for online. Um, but they know more about this, A, because they're being taught it in school, and B, because they have engaged with this from a much younger age. So they know that every time your software updates, every time your phone does an update, you have to go back in and change the default settings because it will have set you to be much more public than you probably want to be, for instance. So that's an area that we can encourage them and help them to see that, oh, you do have knowledge and skills here. And furthermore, we expect you to use them then for good. Help us use them for good and use them for good yourselves. So if you are one of those who feels a little anxious about what young people do online, this might be a place where you could comfortably invite them to teach you how to do this. All right. It is 8 o'clock, and so I think we will pause with this conversation, but know that I'll be around through the end of the conference. So if you have other questions or ideas, I would love to hear more about your thoughts on this subject as well.